Okay, so today we're going to dive into a topic that's pretty universally relevant, I think. Healthy boundaries.
Yeah.
We've got some fascinating material here that really gets into like what boundaries even are,
Right.
why they can be so tricky to actually set,
Oh, yeah.
and then most importantly, I think how we can start to put them into practice in our own lives.
Absolutely. And it's something that I think almost everyone can relate to.
Yeah.
You know, that feeling of being overwhelmed or stretched too thin or even like a little resentful in certain relationships.
Yeah.
And often, that comes back to boundaries.
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to dissect today, giving you hopefully a really solid understanding.
Right.
And even some practical tools that you can actually use.
Absolutely. I think if you've ever found yourself saying yes to something when you really wanted to say no, or, felt that kind of pang of guilt after choosing to prioritize your own needs for once you're in the right place.
For sure.
So we're going to break down like what boundaries actually are.
And it might not be what you initially think.
Interesting.
We'll dig into why it's so hard for so many of us to say no.
Right.
Figure out how to recognize when your boundaries need some work.
Okay.
And then give you some actual phrases and techniques to use.
Love that.
So hopefully you walk away from this feeling more confident in voicing your needs and building those healthier connections without the guilt trip.
Without the guilt, yeah. It's all about, kind of removing that guilt.
Right.
So let's start with the basics.
Okay.
What are boundaries, really?
Yeah, what are we even talking about here when we say boundaries?
It's not about building walls, is it?
No, not at all.
Okay.
I like to think of them more like those guardrails on a winding road.
Okay.
They're there to keep you safe and on track.
Right.
Boundaries are kind of the same. They're those invisible lines that we draw to define what we are and are not okay with.
I like that.
Protecting our time and energy,
Yes.
our values, our emotional well-being, all of that.
So important. And the sources we looked at had some really concrete examples.
Okay, let's hear them.
Like being able to just say, I'm not comfortable with that.
Simple.
Or I need some space. Or even I won't accept being spoken to in that way.
Right, being direct.
Yes. And a really common one is, I can't commit to that right now.
That's huge.
It is. And what's interesting is that setting boundaries isn't about being difficult or standoffish.
Right.
It's more about just being clear.
Clarity.
Yeah. When people know what our boundaries are, they know what to expect.
Makes sense.
And that can actually lead to more respectful and authentic relationships.
Oh, I see. So it prevents those misunderstandings before they even pop up.
Exactly. And on the flip side, when we don't have those boundaries, when those guardrails are missing, things can get messy.
Yeah. What happens then?
Well, one thing the sources really highlighted was resentment.
Oh, yeah. Resentment.
It can build up when we're constantly giving and giving without taking care of our own needs.
Like running on empty all the time.
Yes. And eventually we just burn out.
It's not sustainable.
Not at all. And there's also this more subtle thing that can happen.
Okay.
Where we start to compromise our own values just to avoid conflict or, please others.
To keep the peace.
Right. But that can be really damaging in the long run.
It's like betraying yourself a little bit, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And it's so common. But the question is why?
Right. Why is it so hard to set boundaries?
That's the million-dollar question.
Like, why is it so difficult for so many of us?
It really is. And the sources pointed to a few key factors.
Okay, like what?
Well, a lot of it stems from how we're raised.
Oh, interesting. You mean like our upbringing?
Yeah, there's this societal pressure to be nice.
To be agreeable.
Exactly. To always be accommodating.
Don't rock the boat.
Right. And to avoid conflict at all costs.
So we learn that putting others first is always the right thing to do.
Exactly. And that message gets ingrained pretty deeply for a lot of us.
So then when we try to assert ourselves and set a boundary, it triggers all this guilt and anxiety.
Totally. Because we're going against that ingrained programming.
And we start worrying about how we'll be perceived.
Oh, yeah. Big time. We think, they're going to think I'm selfish.
Or uncaring.
Or difficult or whatever it might be.
Right. And that fear is powerful.
It is. We're afraid of hurting someone's feeling.
Of causing a conflict.
And even of being rejected,
Yeah, that's a primal fear. Like being ostracized from the group.
Absolutely. And so all of that makes saying no.
Which is supposed to be such a simple word.
I know, right?
Feel almost impossible.
Yeah. But the sources offered a really interesting reframe on this.
Okay, tell me more.
They emphasize that saying no to a request isn't necessarily a rejection of the person.
Right.
It's actually a way of saying yes to yourself.
I love that.
Yeah, saying yes to your own needs and your well-being.
It's about prioritizing yourself.
Exactly. And that's so important.
And it makes sense because, if a relationship can't handle you, setting healthy boundaries, maybe that relationship isn't as strong as you thought it was.
That's a good point. And the sources also talked about how the truly meaningful connections,
the ones that matter.
Yes, are the ones that can accommodate those needs.
The ones that can handle your no.
Exactly. And that doesn't mean those relationships are always easy.
Right.
But there's mutual respect there.
So how do we know if our own boundaries need some work?
Yeah. Are there signs we can look out for?
Like red flags that maybe we need to set some stronger boundaries?
Yes. And I think it's worth asking yourself a few questions.
Okay.
Do you constantly find yourself saying yes, even when you're already overwhelmed?
Oh, yeah. Feeling overcommitted.
Exactly. Or do you feel emotionally drained after interacting with certain people?
Drained like you've given too much.
Exactly. And what about guilt? Do you feel guilty when you try to take time for yourself?
Oh, yeah. Like you should be doing something else.
Right. And another big one is that feeling of being taken for granted.
Like people just expect you to always be there.
Yeah. And they don't necessarily reciprocate.
That's tough.
It is. And finally, the sources talked about this tendency to suppress our own thoughts and feelings.
To avoid conflict.
Right. Because we don't want to cause any drama.
But that can't be healthy.
No, it's not. It just leads to resentment and unhappiness.
So if you're noticing any of these patterns,
it
might be time to reassess those boundaries.
Absolutely. And the good news is that it's never too late to start making changes.
That's encouraging.
It is. But how do we actually do it?
Right. What are the practical steps?
How do we start setting boundaries without feeling like we have to over-explain ourselves or apologize profusely?
Yeah, we need some actionable advice.
Totally. And one of the biggest takeaways from the sources was this.
Okay.
You are allowed to have needs.
It's okay to have needs.
And you don't need to apologize for them.
You don't have to over-explain.
Exactly. A simple, clear, and direct statement is often the most effective.
So no more long-winded justifications.
No, just a straightforward no.
I like that.
And the sources even provided some really useful phrases.
Okay, give us some examples.
So let's say someone asks you for a favor, but you're already swamped. You could simply say, I appreciate you thinking of me, but I don't have the capacity to take that on right now.
That's perfect. It's direct, but polite.
Yeah, and it doesn't invite further discussion.
What about social situations?
Oh, yeah, like if a friend invites you out, but you need some time to recharge, you could say?
Yeah.
That sounds lovely, and I'd love to see you soon, but I'm prioritizing some quiet time for myself this weekend.
That's great. It clearly communicates your need.
Yes, but it also leaves the door open for future plans.
And what about when someone's behavior crosses a line?
That's a good one. The sources said if someone says something disrespectful or makes you uncomfortable, you can say, I'm not okay with what was just said. Let's take a moment.
That's so helpful because it addresses the issue right then and there.
Yeah. And in a closer relationship, like with a partner, if a boundary is being disregarded, you might say,
okay,
this is really important to me, and I need us to respect this if we want to move forward in a healthy way together.
I love how these phrases emphasize that.
Yeah.
Clarity is actually a form of kindness.
That's so true. By being upfront about our boundaries, we're actually helping others understand how to treat us respectfully.
And preventing future conflicts.
Exactly. But what about the fear that setting boundaries will damage our relationships?
Right, because we worry about pushing people away.
But the sources actually suggest that healthy boundaries can actually strengthen our connections.
Really? How so?
Well, when we have those boundaries in place, we tend to experience less resentment.
Because we're not feeling taken advantage of.
Exactly. And that reduction in negativity fosters more trust in the relationship.
It builds a foundation of respect.
And the forces also talked about how boundaries contribute to a sense of safety.
Oh, interesting. Safety. How so?
Because when everyone knows what to expect,
it
creates a more predictable dynamic.
There are fewer surprises.
Yeah, and fewer opportunities for misunderstandings and hurt feelings.
Makes sense.
And by consistently setting and upholding our boundaries, we're teaching others how we want to be treated.
It sets the standard.
Yes. And this can lead to more respectful interactions overall.
So in a way, boundaries are actually a gift.
They are. They're a gift to ourselves and to the people we care about.
Now, the sources made a really interesting distinction.
Oh, yeah.
Between people who respect our boundaries and those who don't.
They called the ones who respect them keepers.
Oh, I like that, keepers.
It's a good term, right?
So how do we figure out who the keepers are in our own lives?
Well, it's about paying attention to how people react.
Okay.
When you start setting those boundaries, the keepers will understand and accept your limits.
Without trying to push back.
Exactly. They might not always love it,
Right.
but they'll respect your needs.
And those who don't?
Yeah, those who get upset or try to manipulate you. Well, it might be a sign that they were benefiting from your lack of boundaries.
Interesting.
So it's something to think about.
It is, and it's important to remember that setting boundaries often brings up feelings of guilt.
Oh, yeah, that guilt can be really intense.
It can, but the sources explain that guilt isn't always a bad thing.
Okay, how so?
They said it can actually be a sign of growth.
Like growing pains.
Yeah, we're breaking free from old patterns, even if it feels uncomfortable.
So that guilt is just a sign that we're doing something new.
Exactly, something that's ultimately better for us.
It's like we're unlearning those old scripts that no longer serve us.
And the sources gave us a really helpful affirmation to use when that guilt pops up.
Yes, I love this one.
What is it?
I am allowed to prioritize my own well-being without needing to apologize for it.
So powerful.
Isn't it? It's a reminder that taking care of ourselves is not selfish.
It's essential.
Exactly. And it can be hard, but it's so worth it.
So as we wrap up, what are some key takeaways for our listeners
Like, what can they actually start doing today?
to build those healthier boundaries?
The sources had some great practical tips.
Okay, lay them on us.
First, start small. You don't have to tackle everything at once.
Little steps.
Yeah, practice saying no in low-stakes situations.
Build up that confidence muscle.
Exactly. And then remember to be both kind and firm in your communication.
Kind but firm.
Yes, you can be respectful while still standing your ground.
And be prepared for some resistance.
Oh, yeah. Not everyone will be happy about your new boundaries.
But stay calm and consistent.
Don't get drawn into arguments or feel pressured to justify yourself.
It's your right to have boundaries.
It is, and remember, consistency is key.
It's an ongoing process.
Like tending a garden.
I love that analogy.
And finally, celebrate your wins.
Yes, acknowledge those moments when you successfully set a boundary.
It's all about progress, not perfection.
So the main message here is that prioritizing your well-being is not selfish.
It's essential.
Saying no when you need to
Yeah.
is a form of self-care.
It's about honoring yourself.
And remember, you're not responsible for everyone else's happiness.
That's huge. We can't control other people's reactions.
We can only control our own actions.
And setting boundaries is about choosing yourself.
Choosing your own well-being.
Exactly. And it's a journey.
It is not a destination.
So as you go about your day, think about one area where you might want to implement a boundary.
Maybe a small one to start.
Yes, and remember every step you take towards setting those boundaries.
Is a step towards.
A more fulfilling and balanced life.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, remember,
Take care of yourself.
you deserve it.
You do.